All right, so we've looked at France as an absolute monarchy, and now we're going to look at the counterpart to absolutism, and that is an economic or a political theory called constitutionalism. And we're going to use England as our case study. And so we're going to look at the constitutional monarchy that is England during that's forms during the 17th century and then lasts into the 18th. So first we need to look at constitutionalism. Constitutionalism is this political concept that there needs to be a limit on the government's power by law. And those laws need to be written down like a constitution. So essentially, in a constitutional monarchy, the written constitution serves to check the power of the monarch, of the king or queen. And there's a set of laws. And that constitution could then establish a parliament, as the case in England, or some other judiciary, in order to check the power of the monarch. And so that's what constitutionalism is all about. It also implies that there's some sort of balance between the power and rights of the government and the power and rights of the individual, and tries to work those out. So we're going to look at how that happens in England. And to first kind of get to this point, we need to hit the Wayback Machine and go back to when we talked previously about Henry VIII. Henry VIII and his English Reformation began to upset the political balance in England, and starts to cause waves that we see as Edward, his son, comes to the throne. Remember that Edward was weak, not an effective ruler, doesn't do a whole lot, and in his weakness, he opens the doors for the nobles to gain a foothold and to gain a little bit more of the power back that had sort of disappeared under Henry VIII with his conversion to Anglicanism and then demanding that people swear loyalty to him as the head of the Church of England. And so after Edward, we have Bloody Mary, who comes around in an effort to suppress the Protestants. And so she executes them. She practices great religious intolerance, and in fact finds herself in many fights with Parliament about this, and as a result of this. And so there is, at this time, real chaos in England, and disorder and distrust in the monarchy. And along then comes Elizabeth. And Queen Elizabeth takes over after Mary, as we recall. And everything she does is an effort to kind of reestablish the monarchy as a reasonable institution and as an institution that can be trusted. And so we see that in her efforts. She manages the finances of the country fairly well, given that they were in massive debt after her father and sister were in charge. She is able to develop a good relationship, a good working relationship with Parliament, which helps her then accomplish many of the things she's looking to achieve. She appoints many ministers who are effective and can do their job. And this then creates this smooth-running government that effectively rules during her time. And so this is kind of looked back upon with fondness, this era where Elizabeth was the queen. And many Protestants view her as this hero. They've sort of romanticized, or at the time they had, I shouldn't say now. At the time they had sort of romanticized her achievements and what she had done in order to bring back tolerance following the era of Mary. And so she is important. And she dies without an heir. And this is where we start beginning this is where we really get into kind of our story, starting to talk about how does England go from this type of monarchy to a constitutional monarchy. So we begin with James Stuart. James is the cousin of Elizabeth, and since Elizabeth was a virgin queen, never married, never had children, he takes over after her death. He also happened to be the King of Scotland, so you have this unification of the King of Scotland. And the King of Scotland and the King of England become one. And so he rules from 1603 to 1625. He is widely regarded as one of the most intelligent individuals to ever rule in England. However, he was not big on kind of the pomp and circumstance that surrounded kingship. He didn't really like London or England. He was very much a Scot at heart and very much in his actions. So as he's on his way, although he's a very intelligent man, as he's on his way to take the throne, he moons the crowd that is watching him go by as he is going to get coronated. So he moons the Londoners, which is funny and not exactly kingly behavior, but it just shows in many ways his disdain for the pomp that surrounds the throne of England. James Stuart, or James I, is really a firm believer in what is known as the divine right theory of government. And essentially what this says is that the kings get the right to rule from God alone. They don't get the right to rule from the people that they are in charge of. They don't get the right to rule from the governed. They don't get the right to rule from Parliament. They get the right to rule from God. God has ordained you to be king, and it is your job then to be the best king that you can be. So James further kind of conceptualizes this concept in a treatise he writes, an essay he writes, really called The True Law of Free Monarchies. And in this, he lays out this concept of divine right, where he says he gets his right to rule from God. And he then tries to tie the role of king to the apostolic succession. That is, Jesus turned over the right to rule religiously to the apostles, and then so on and so forth. It goes down until modern day. And James really tries to apply this to kings and says that Jesus and God would have appointed him to rule in this modern day. And he was just following the line of succession. So that's his belief. And because of this, he really gets into a tons of arguments with Parliament over its role in the country. He believes that all power and all rights to power rest with the king, because God chose the king. Not anybody else, God chose the king. And because God chose the king, Parliament had no right to kind of argue against him or try to force his hand with anything. He had the right to do whatever it was he wanted because he was just following God's will, right? That's his belief. And so he doesn't get along with Parliament. And this becomes a problem because James II is constantly finding himself running out of money. And so when he runs out of money, he's stuck where he needs to raise taxes in order to make up for his increasing expenses and decreasing revenues. Now, under English law, the only way in which you can pass new taxes is through Parliament. Because he doesn't get along with Parliament, because he doesn't believe Parliament has any right to do or to make laws or to counteract what he's saying, he doesn't really get along with them. And so Parliament's not really willing to work with them. So they fight time and time again over this concept of taxation. And this is a fight that his son, who we'll look at in a second, takes up with him as well. So James I also, one of the things he does is he orders a new translation, a new English translation of the Bible. This is the King James Version, which is still used today. It's the most popular Bible used around. But despite this, many Anglicans, many of the Protestants in England, believed that he was too sympathetic to Catholics. And they still had Bloody Mary fresh in their minds. Although it was many years ago, it was still very recent enough for them to remember and fear this sympathy for the Catholic causes, because it had ended in bloodshed before. So, James I follows his father, Charles I follows his father, James I. He becomes king in 1625, and he also agrees in this divine right concept. And why wouldn't you? If you were king, of course you're going to believe in divine right, because that means you are the only one who has power. You have to answer to nobody except for God. And so Parliament is just a nuisance to them. So he, like his father, as I mentioned before, was constantly fighting against Parliament. He didn't agree with them, really their right to exist, certainly not their right to check his power, and so he was constantly at odds with them. So in 1628, he finally just decides he doesn't need Parliament anymore, and he signs a law called the Petition of Right, and then dismisses Parliament. And for the next 11 years, he tries to rule without Parliament. And this is called the personal rule of Charles I. This is the time where he has dissolved Parliament. And the way Parliament would work is it wouldn't always sit in session. It would just come together when it was called by the king. So the king would call it and say, hey, I need you to pass these laws. Please do it. They would do it. Or they wouldn't, depending on if they like the king or queen. And then they would leave. Charles just says, forget this. I'm dissolving you, and I'm just not going to call you again. Now, this is problematic because, of course, like his father, he needs money. And money comes from taxes. So Charles, instead of creating new taxes because he can't without Parliament, tries to come up with this workaround. And this workaround that he comes up with is by raising the fees on certain things that the king could do. And the most famous of these is ship money. And what he would do is, ship money is an old concept that rulers would use in times of war. Countries or counties that are right along the coastline would have to pay an extra tax, and that tax would go towards building ships. And that could either be money, that could be labor, that could be supplies, it could be whatever. But generally money. And so this money would then be funneled into building ships for this time of war. So the king is allowed to call for ship money. So what Charles decides to do is call for ship money, even though they're not at war. And worse than that, he expands this ship money fees to counties that don't even border the ocean. So these inland towns are forced to pay this tax for, quote, building ships or ship money. And quite often that money doesn't actually go towards ships. And so needless to say, people get incredibly frustrated. Incredibly frustrated. And they don't like him. And there are many little rebellions about this, and there's people speaking out very passionately against him. During this time, Charles is advised by a guy by the name of William Laud. He's an Archbishop of Canterbury. He eventually gets his head cut off. Charles kind of goes away from this religious freedom that had sort of existed, or at least religious moderate tolerance, and he persecutes anyone who doesn't follow what is the High Anglican Church. And so this makes him an enemy of Puritans because Puritans are not exactly followers of this. They are Calvinists. And so this is problematic for many, many people. Charles is starting to make, if you can't tell, a lot of enemies, right? People who don't want to pay ship money, people who are not Anglican, people who in Parliament, the nobles, all these sorts of things. And then in the midst of this, Charles decides that he wants to force the Scots to be Anglican. And if you recall, the Scots were mostly Presbyterian at this point, following John Knox. And Charles says, you're all going to become Anglican because I am the head of the Church of England, and I want you to follow not just my political views, but also my religious views. And the Scots, notoriously independent, absolutely refuse to go along with this. And so they rebel. Now, this is really where Charles finds himself in trouble. Because in order to fight this war, Charles needs money. And he needs real money, not just money raised from ship money and other weird fines. He needs taxes. And so he is forced to call Parliament in 1640 to raise taxes to fight the Scots. And this is called the Short Parliament because they gather for like half a second, nothing gets done, and then they're dissolved because Charles doesn't like them. He realizes they're going to go against him, and he calls for new elections. And so new people are elected to this Parliament, and this Parliament shows up and they say, essentially, we're not leaving. They say, we're never going to finish our job here. We are going to sit in session no matter what, because we don't trust you to call us again to govern. They basically force his hand, saying, you have to govern with us. You can't rule without us. And so this long Parliament sits for the next 20 years. The same guys, and that will become a problem in a minute that we'll see here. So Charles is frustrated with these people, and he decides that he wants to arrest them. that backfires because his attempt to arrest Parliament's leaders leads directly to the Civil War. And during this, there are two sides. The supporters of the king are called the Royalists, or also the Cavaliers. They have this cavalier kind of freewheeling attitude, and their style of dress was known as Cavalier. And Parliament supporters were known as Roundheads because they all had bowl cuts. Maybe not all of them, but a lot of them did. So initially, the Cavaliers are wildly successful. The Royalists start winning a lot of battles. They're pushing them back. But this success doesn't last forever. Eventually, the Roundheads are victorious. And the reason they're able to do this is because they appoint Oliver Cromwell to restore the army, right? So they're losing battle after battle, and they say, hey, Oliver Cromwell, we need you to fix this army. And Cromwell creates something called the New Model Army. And in the New Model Army, he's all about harsh discipline, he's all about lots of training, and lots of Puritan religious fervor. That is kind of living that perfect Puritan life, all the while training very hard to go out there and kill any enemies of the Puritans, specifically the Royalists. And this New Model Army takes the field, and they are basically unstoppable. And so it does not take long before that army is successful in capturing Charles in 1647. The problem is that Charles escapes, and he runs north to Scotland, the people whom he had previously been trying to oppress with Anglicanism, although where his family is from, so he still has some support. And he makes an agreement with the Scots to invade England. They do so, but at their first battle, the Scots basically bail on him, are like, forget this isn't worth it, not going to happen. And so the Scots are defeated, Charles is recaptured. Cromwell and others in Parliament decide, hey, we need to put this guy on trial for treason, because what he has done to our country is treasonous. He's gone against our nation. And what we see happen is this odd moment where you can see that Parliament has really bought in to this concept of divine right, because many of the people of Parliament refuse to take part in the trial. They refuse to believe that they can try the king because the king himself was ordained by God. And by trying the king, they would be going against God's will. So they refuse to partake in this. Cromwell tells his army to remove members of the Parliament who are not willing to take part in this trial. And this is known as Pride's Purge, and these people are physically removed from Parliament and banned. And the remaining members of Parliament, I think there's 135 of them or so, is what is known as the Rump Parliament, the leftover Parliament. Those who are left behind, who are willing to partake in this sham known as this trial of the king. His trial happens in 1849. It lasts merely 9 days. They tried him as king, accused him of treason, which again creates this problem because Charles, since he is still king, he has not been dethroned, refuses to acknowledge that Parliament has any authority over him whatsoever. He believes that he was ordained by God, and that God chose him to rule, and God did not choose Parliament to rule. God does not want Parliament. God wants a king. And so he refuses to acknowledge this authority. However, after 9 short days, he is found guilty of treason. The vote goes against him 68-67. He is sentenced to death. The last vote comes from Cromwell. So you can see that this is not necessarily a popular move. You have to remember that these people who are voting are just the remnants of the entirety of the Parliament, right? This is the Rump Parliament. And the people who were not in Parliament anymore would likely have favored to set him free. I mean, these are people who didn't even believe he should be tried because God had ordained him. God had appointed him to be king. So after this short delay, he is voted to be killed. And again, all it took was one vote, one person to change their mind, and he would have survived. History would have looked a lot different. But they don't. Cromwell sentences him to death, and he is publicly beheaded on January 30th. Now, this is a huge blow to this concept of divine right of kings, because if God chose you to be king, and God really wanted you to be king, God probably wouldn't have let you get your head cut off. And so this really does not bode well for any monarchs who believe in divine rights of kings. And we'll see this this is the beginning of the end of the divine right concept theory. And that really ends when Louis XVI gets his head cut off. But this beheading basically says, look, if God really wanted you to be king, he wouldn't have let you get your head cut off. So this leads to a time known as the Protectorate. This time is, the Protectorate is basically called, England is declared to be a commonwealth, that is a republic where people, wealthy, landowning people, have a right to vote. At least in theory they do, although that never happens. This concept of England as a commonwealth during the Protectorate is not exactly true, although it's not as much of a military dictatorship as a lot of histories would have you believe. But essentially it's ruled by one person, Cromwell, in a dictatorial style for the most part. Cromwell is established as the Lord Protector of the Commonwealth. He rules with a parliament, however, so it's important to note that he does not disband parliament. Although this is the same long parliament that exists, remember, from 1640 until 1660, and it is mostly the rump parliament, that is, people who have acquiesced to him. Cromwell is strictly Puritan, and like he reformed the New Model Army, he attempts to reform England as a whole. So he imposes lots of social restrictions. He closes pubs, theaters, bars, dance halls, gambling houses. He said no more public celebrations. He essentially turned England into one giant island of no fun allowed. He goes so far as to ban skipping and whistling. Everything that you could think of as being mildly entertaining or fun, Cromwell says you cannot do. He must have been a miserable person. But he is a ruthless leader. And when the people rise up in Ireland against him, he is very quick to crush them and then kind of begin this mini colonization of Ireland, where he's sending English people over to settle and take over the good land. In 1653, he dismisses Parliament and tries to rule as this military dictator. It's not super successful. Parliament still is meeting, but kind of in hiding. And his son Richard tries to take his place when Cromwell dies in 1658, but is not successful because people are sick of it. And so people are sick of this military concept. They are sick of a dictatorship, and most of them still want a king. Recall that in 1660, we are still well over 100 years away from the American Revolution. People at this time can't really fathom any type of government other than a monarchy. That is what they are used to. Most people did not want Charles to die. They wanted Charles to exist. They wanted the king to exist. And so when Cromwell finally dies, Parliament asks, they've decided then we need a monarch, and so they ask his son, Charles II, to return to England and accept the throne. And Charles II had been living in exile. Obviously, you see your dad's head cut off, you go as far out of the country as you possibly can. And so Parliament says, hey, we'd like you to come back and be our king. Charles II agrees to this, and why, I don't know, it's beyond me, but he agrees to come back. And this term is known as the Restoration. This time period when Charles II inherits the throne is known as the Restoration. He reopens theaters, dance halls, and all the public entertainment that had been closed during Cromwell. And this is how he earns the moniker, the Merry Monarch. He is basically willing to have fun and allow his subjects to have fun under his rule. He, as the head of the Church of England, becomes a lot more tolerant. They become more willing to accept Catholics living in their country. They are kind of all good with that. He, in order to kind of develop this stronger relationship with Parliament, he uses this council of 5 well-elected men to act as liaisons for him to Parliament. And this helps him maintain good rapport with Parliament. And so it kind of reestablishes a relationship that had not existed under his father, Charles I, or his grandfather, James I. Under Charles II, there's a lot of other things that happen. The last known outbreak of the plague in London happens, the Great London Fire happens, Guy Fawkes tries to blow up Parliament, all this good stuff. And in 1673, an interesting law is passed under the rule of Charles II. It's called the Test Act, and that says that everyone who's in government has to be members of the Anglican Church, except for the royal family. And this is a notable exception that we'll see when we get to James. So this is an important exception that will show up in a little bit here. But Charles, while kind of requiring that government officials be Anglican, he does, as I mentioned before, allow the Church of England to become more tolerant. And part of the reason why he does that is because he signs a secret treaty with France and with King Louis XIV. And the deal is basically Louis XIV and France will give England, and specifically Charles, £200,000 per year. And in return, all Charles has to do is relax some of the anti-Catholic laws. He has to agree not to interfere with French attacks against Protestant Netherlands. And that's pretty much it. Stay out of their issues on the continent. So Charles is down with that. He says, that sounds like a good deal to me. I'll take this money. Charles has many, many, many children. Unfortunately for him, all of them are illegitimate. And he acknowledges 14 illegitimate children. There were probably more. But this is a problem because when he dies, none of his children are legitimate. So the throne has to pass to somebody else. And it passes to his younger brother, James. James II, no, he becomes James II, becomes king in 1865. Because that's the way that the crown worked. And the reason why he's able to become king is that Test Act allowed a provision for the royal family to be Catholic, even though no other government official could. He had 2 wives. His first wife, he had 2 children, Mary and Anne, and they were both from his first wife, who was Anglican, but then he remarried a Catholic wife. And so the English people were not super happy with James, in part because he was considered very cruel, not very intelligent, not very considerate, but also because of his Catholicism, right? We're still only about 100 years removed from Bloody Mary. We're talking about this real anti-Catholic feelings. It wasn't that long ago. Again, less than 100 years since the Spanish Armada. You've had Catholic interference with Louis XIV. That treaty that Charles signed, by the way, became public knowledge fairly quickly. So there's lots of kind of underlying distrust of Catholics. And James is Catholic, and so people are kind of unsure about that. But they figured, well, he'll eventually die, and since his 2 daughters are Anglican, we'll be okay. James starts to push back, though, and he repeals the Test Act, and he starts appointing Catholics to high offices in his government and to really important posts. And this starts to set people on edge. Things culminate in June of 1688, when his second wife, who is Catholic, gives birth to a son. And this is a real problem for the people of England, because now this possibility of a Catholic dynasty is real. They thought that when James died out, the throne would pass to his daughters, they'd be Anglican, it'd be just fine. But now he's got a Catholic son. And now they're really afraid, because now they're going to have a Catholic monarch. That Catholic monarch is going to be serving as a puppet of the French monarch. He's going to force Catholicism upon everybody, and we're going to go back to the way things were during Bloody Mary, when everybody dies. And nobody wants that. So, what happens is, Parliament takes matters into their own hands, and they invite James's daughter Mary, who has gone off to marry a guy named William in the Netherlands, to return to England and take the throne. And so William and Mary return to England at the head of an army. James realizes very, very quickly that he's not going to be able to raise an army to fight them because Parliament doesn't support him. Parliament has turned their back on him and are supporting William and Mary. So James bails. He flees the country, goes to France. And this is known as the Glorious Revolution, in large part because no blood had been shed. Now in 1890, James kind of raises this ragtag mercenary army and tries to reattack the country, but fails miserably and is defeated. But this Glorious Revolution is essentially a bloodless revolution that turns over power. Now, one of the contingencies to Parliament inviting William and Mary back is that they had to accept a constitution, which we'll look at in a second. But this Glorious Revolution is a concept that, I mean, this is shocking, right? We're still operating somewhat under the concept of the divine right of kings, where God has appointed these kings. But that idea is further shattered. Well, it's really shattered when Charles first gets his head cut off. But it's further shattered when Parliament goes behind their king's back and invites someone else to take the throne. And Parliament justifies this because they build off this Enlightenment idea from John Locke and this concept of natural rights. And John Locke says the government's job, the role of government, is to protect the natural rights of people, life, liberty, and property. As soon as the government goes beyond protecting those things, the government is no longer a government for the people, but rather it is a tyranny. So it moves to a tyranny. And in a tyranny, people have a right to rebel in order to restore their natural rights of life, liberty, and property. So this quickly becomes the justification for why Parliament is able to stage this essentially coup. And so William and Mary rule as co-monarchs, and the rule is that you can be king and queen, but in addition, in order for that to happen, you need to sign the English Bill of Rights, which is the constitution that serves as the check to the power of monarchy, right, that we talked about at the very beginning. And so the Bill of Rights says kind of the following things for the most part. First is that taxes require Parliament's approval. And that was already on the books. They're just kind of reaffirming that and taking out loopholes for things like ship money and other things like that that Charles I had used to kind of circumvent the process. The next is that freedom of speech is granted and gained in Parliament. Only in Parliament, this is done to kind of encourage open dialogue and discussion and allow for some sort of political opposition. Under the English Bill of Rights, the king cannot suspend the laws. He is not the legislative body. Only the Parliament can do that. Cruel and unusual punishments are outlawed. The freedom to bear arms for the purposes of self-defense is guaranteed. And there are to be no fines or forfeits of property without trial. That is essentially a way for the nobles to protect themselves for when the king tries to make a grab at their land and take it away from them. And so all that we're seeing is that Parliament is putting checks on the power of the king and the king and queen in this instance. They are creating laws that are designed to ensure that the king and queen do not have too much power, but rather that they have a certain amount of power that is monitored or overseen by Parliament. So this is a really, really big step forward, and it's really a deviation from previous things. Yes, in the past there had been Parliament, and the king kind of had to keep them on his good side in order to rule effectively. But there was nothing ever codified until this English Bill of Rights is codified in 1689. And this really lays out what is expected and what is required of both the king and Parliament. Another stipulation to this is that Roman Catholics couldn't be king or queen of England. This law stays on the books until the 2000s. Again, there's just this real distrust of Catholicism, of the French, and it shows the lasting impact of Mary's rule. We have Mary dying, Bloody Mary, her rule. We have Mary dies in 1694 and William in 1702. And the problem is, we have this little switch in power. Because when William dies, he doesn't have an heir. And so Mary's younger sister, Anne, takes over. Anne, the daughter of James II. Okay. She continues to fight France in the War of Spanish Succession, which had begun in 1700. She gets pregnant 18 times, has lots of children, but she outlives all of them. And dies in 1714 and does not have an heir. The only heir, I should say, is the son of James II, but he's Catholic. So he can't be the King of England because they didn't like Catholics. And so, according to the law of succession, then it has to go to the next closest relative, the closest living Protestant relative, I should say. And that goes to a guy by the name of George of Hanover. Hanover's in Germany. George comes to the throne as George I, and he comes, and he's completely unable to speak English, but that's okay. So we have this shift in power away from the Stuart line, and it goes to the Hanover line, which is not terribly important, but it is important to recognize that there is such a fear and distrust of Catholics that we have a skip over James's son, James II's son, because they so distrust Catholics, and it goes to George I. Under George and the Hanoverian kings, we see this new type of government called the cabinet system. And essentially what happens is under these kings, we see the role of the monarch being reduced even further. And so the Hanovers begin to rely on this small group of ministers, men who they appoint but are approved by people in the House of Commons. So the rules for these ministers are that they have to be currently seated in the House of Commons. They have to be elected to the House of Commons. And they have to be they have to get tacit approval by the House of Commons to be these ministers. And then these 5 ministers, or however many there are, serve as official advisors to the king and kind of policy makers. And they work to keep the peace between the king and parliament, much like James I had done. And so, Charles II had done that, not James I. And so we see that the king is really heavily reliant on these cabinet members. And at first, the king is sitting in these cabinet meetings and helping to make policies. But eventually, and that's George I who does that, eventually George II and so on tend to turn the cabinet meeting over to others and let their chief ministers rule while they act as sort of a nominal figurehead rather than conducting any real political decision making. And so this is where we see this shift of constitutionalism even more. We have this total transformation away from an absolute monarchy to so we have an absolute monarchy, and then we shift to a constitutional monarchy under William and Mary, and then by the time we get to the Hanovers with George I and George II, again, you still have a constitutional monarchy, but the monarch is taking even less of a role in the day-to-day decision. And so this is 2 contrasting styles between England and France. In France, you have this grab for absolutism, where in England you have this setting up of a check and balance, where you have a king whose power is checked by a constitution that rules in conjunction with a parliament. And that is the way the English get the constitutional monarchy that they have still to this day.